Hello everyone. Please make yourself comfortable because tonight we have another long exploration of space and time ahead. This is going to be an overview of medicine and healing across history and civilizations, from prehistory to the present. I will tell you about technique and biology, but beyond that, it is also interesting to explore how different cultures have looked at the link between body and mind, at the origins of illness, or what healing actually is. As always, this story is going to be long, more than 1 hour. But you can navigate between the chapters using the timestamps on your screen, in the description box, and in the comment pinned under the video. In this comment you will also find links to listen to my stories on Spotify and other streaming services, and a link to Patreon if you wish to support this channel. Get everything to download. There are more than 100 stories available for download, and contribute to keep it free of ad breaks. But now, let's begin. There is very little record of prehistoric medicine and concepts around it. The first records begin with early civilizations. But there is no doubt that healing practices existed. They are revealed by archaeology and what we know of prehistoric societies, actually taking care of the wounded and the old is a distinctive characteristic of human beings, or at most, a limited number of social mammals, including humans. It is hard to make comparisons with animals, but some social animals take care of each other, and not only instinctively with their youngs. For example, adult wolves may lick each other's wounds as part of their social behavior. They don't have medicine, of course, but they form bonds that make them care for each other inside their society. And sometimes the opportunity to recover for an individual, thanks to the help of others, makes the difference between life and death. But for any kind of medical knowledge to develop, the other important thing is the transmission from each generation to the next. And that's actually the big difference between humans and other social animals. In our lifetime, we are past knowledge from previous generations. We learn languages to communicate. We learn plenty of techniques and behaviors that have been proved for generations, and we transmit them to our children, incremented with new ones. This is the engine of human technical progress in comparison with all other species. You can have hundreds of generations of wolves, or apes, or ants. They will not progress technically. Because even though individuals may learn things during their lives, they don't transmit them to their offspring. There is no accumulation of knowledge generation after generation, on which future generations could build on. In contrast, humans passed on their discoveries, and they constantly add more. The fact that we have cars or cell phones today is the product of an extraordinary accumulation of discoveries and know-how, from fire and metallurgy to mathematics, electricity, chemistry, waves. The generation that produced cell phones combined many different previous inventions or processes that actually began to appear hundreds of generations ago. I'm telling you all this because medical knowledge, whatever its form or efficacy, also works like this. Generations after generations, in a society or a civilization, practices are passed on because they have been observed or they are believed to work. And yet another characteristic of human societies is that they attribute a meaning, an interpretation to their practices and what happens in their world. In the case of illness, animals don't ask themselves why they are sick, what causes their state. Humans do. They need causes, reasons. And this is why a common point in all the cultures we will talk about tonight is that they assign an explanation to illness. It can be spirits, imbalances in the body or the mind, it can be magic, or more technical explanations like poison or viruses. Some of these we can believe or not. But in any case, there is this drive to understand and find cures that always guided the development of medicine. And there are signs that this happened long before the first writing systems. On prehistoric sites, remains were found that indicate not just the making of treatments with herbs or clays, but also attempts at dentistry or surgery. The first known dentistry, for example, dates to about 9,000 years ago, during the Neolithic, and we know it because flint-tipped drills and bowstrings used to act on teeth were found in the Middle East. The first known trepanning, that is to say the action of making a hole in the skull, possibly to relieve pressure inside the skull, or to extract fragments. This happened around 7,000 years ago on a prehistoric site in France. Possibly earlier, this is just the oldest archaeological proof of it. What we also know with a good degree of certainty about prehistoric medicine and societies, at least of the Neolithic, is that individuals had different social roles, and the healer was one of them. This function was occupied by shamans, that is to say, the person who interacted with the spirits, or by apothecaries, the people in charge of making and providing remedies made with plants. So it is unclear to which extent these societies distinguished between magical or religious practices and the practice of medicine or the making of drugs, of treatments. In any case, the very blur line between the two is something characteristic of early civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, when a person became ill, doctors would prescribe both magical formulas to be recited, as well as medical treatments. The oldest written medical prescription we know of was from Mesopotamia, from Sumer, and it was dated to 4,000 years ago. And in the following centuries appeared the first texts on medicine, with this mix of magical formulas and medication that were recommended for all kinds of diseases. Also in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians were the first, with the Egyptians, we will talk about them in a minute, to introduce in the 2nd millennium BC, that's 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, the principles of physical examination, of diagnosis, of prognosis, that is to say, the forecast about the evolution of the patient, and recipes for remedies. That's important because it shows the conception that illness is not just a state. There are different illnesses, different pathologies, and it was a doctor's role to determine which one it was and what treatment it called for. There is a text called the Diagnostic Handbook, which is also the most extensive Babylonian medical text, which presented a list of medical symptoms together with empirical observations about how they can manifest on the patient's body. These symptoms or combinations of symptoms pointed to certain illnesses in a very logical, systematic way. We may find the treatments offered little credible, magic formulas, but there was already here concepts that still exist in modern medicine. The observation of symptoms, the elaboration of specific treatments for specific illnesses, and also the search for efficient treatments, things that work. So there were recipes for herbal treatments, creams, with precise proportions that had to be respected. The ancient Mesopotamians had also observed that certain sets of conditions favored the spread of certain contagious diseases. They didn't know why or how, of course, but pragmatically they also took measures to separate patients from healthy people to prevent the spread of disease. Generally, we don't know well what the appearance of particular illnesses was attributed to by the Mesopotamians, whether they thought it was spirits, psychological problems, curses. But in the case of mental illnesses, they believed the disorders were caused by specific deities. Hallucinations or erratic behavior would have been caused by the influence of a god or a goddess. And because hands symbolized control over a person in their culture, they called various mental disorders after deities. There was the hand of Ishtar, the hand of Shamash, and so on. We don't know to which illnesses these corresponded, the modern terminology for it, if there was any. But here again, they made distinctions, and a doctor's role was to use his systematic knowledge of symptoms and his examination of the patient to make a diagnosis, a prognosis, and recommend a suitable treatment. In ancient Egypt, medicine had similarities with Mesopotamia, especially this mix of magic and plant or mineral or animal-based recipes that were offered as treatment, and the approach based on observation and diagnosis. But the Egyptians pushed it to even more detailing of pathologies and produced a lot of documents detailing cures, ailments, and anatomical observations. The oldest one we know of is called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and it dates from the mid-2nd millennium BC. But it was probably a copy of several earlier works that were as ancient as Mesopotamian documents. An important figure in Egyptian medicine was Imhotep, the chancellor to the pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty. He could have been the architect of Djoser's pyramid, which is famous for being a large step pyramid, a precursor to the more familiar smooth pyramids that were built from the 4th dynasty, the most famous of these are the pyramids of Giza. Djoser lived a few generations before, during the Third Dynasty, that was in the 27th century BC, almost 5,000 years ago. Little is known about the life of Imhotep, the historical character, but in the 3,000 years following his death, he was gradually glorified and even deified as a wise man and then as a kind of father of medicine. Was he really? It is hard to tell, because in the first 1200 years following his death, no texts that we know of mention his name. We know he existed, he was a real person, thanks to inscriptions contemporary to his life that mention his name and establish him as chancellor to the pharaoh. So it is believed that he was mostly forgotten for a long time. He lived at a time when almost all the most spectacular monuments of Egypt did not exist yet. The country had been unified, north and south, and already had an ancient culture. But the Egyptian civilization had not acquired yet the brilliance that centuries and centuries of cultural refinement, of art, of architecture would give it. So, more than 1,000 years after his death, the name of Imhotep began to resurface in texts of the 14th century BC. And later statues of him were made too. This was during the New Kingdom, and Imhotep's fame kept rising to the point that he was venerated as a demigod by the end of the New Kingdom, but not as a healer yet, rather as an extraordinary ancestor, a producer of wisdom. The first references to his healing abilities occur even later, from the 4th century BC, 2,200 years after his death, and at this point he had become a patron of physicians. So it is not impossible that Imhotep did indeed conduct research or compile texts in the field of medicine, and maybe this memory would have been passed on over several centuries. But to Egyptologists, the more likely explanation is that his figure was adopted much later by priests and medical doctors to turn his name, that they knew was the name of a real person who had existed and a prominent man of his time, into their divine holy patron. He was also later credited for inventing the mummification rituals that were so important to the Egyptians. This is unproven. What is proven is that the Egyptians were the first to create what we could call a public health service. There were institutions called houses of life where people could go to be examined and offered treatment by physicians, a kind of equivalent for the living of the houses of the dead, where bodies were prepared for their burial. Overall, in the Antiquity, especially the late Antiquity, it seems the Egyptians were renowned for their good health relatively to other peoples. There are Greek authors, Herodotus for example, who mentioned it. Was it because of their health system and their medical knowledge, or should it be attributed to the climate, because Egypt is rather dry, and most of the time people were fed sufficiently, which are important factors? It is hard to know. But for their time, the Egyptians were probably quite advanced in the medical field. They practiced surgeries and trepanings. These were rather dangerous last resort acts, but texts and remains of buried people indicate that at least some of the patients survived and lived on. They also had a few really effective drugs, especially painkillers. They knew how to prepare basic opioids, for example. Now, in the 2nd millennium BC, as the figure of Imhotep was rising in Egypt, another region of the world where complex medical practices were developed was India. Several texts containing prescriptions of herbs for ailments and dealing with medicine in general appeared in the 2nd millennium. They are parts of the Vedas. I told you about the Vedas recently in a story about the history of Buddhism. I'll put a link in the description. The Vedas were ancient Indian texts that still serve as a reference, especially in Hinduism. In the 7th and 6th centuries BC, the synthesis of traditional herbal practices with a lot of theoretical elaboration about the human mind and supernatural forces gave birth to a new medical system called Ayurveda. Veda means knowledge in Sanskrit. Ayurveda means complete knowledge for long life, and it has become famous, including outside of India, as the traditional Indian medicine. Actually, there were other schools in the past. For example, in medieval times, another form of medicine called Unani was introduced by Muslim sovereigns to India. It had Persian and Arab influences. But Ayurveda and Unani had similarities in their approach to health and its preservation or restoration. Illness or any kind of health problem, according to them, are not the product of malevolent spirits or divine influence, as we saw for mental illness in Mesopotamia. They came from imbalances between elements in someone's body. Ancient Ayurveda considered that the traditional elements of earth, fire, air and water were present in all bodies, but the elements that cause imbalances are not these ones. They are called doshas. These doshas are 3 different categories of substances that are believed to be present in any person's system. These 3 elements are called wind, bile and phlegm, and they would fluctuate in the body according to the seasons, the time of day, the process of digestion and other factors, and thereby they would determine changing conditions of growth, aging, health or disease. Now the balance of these 3 categories would be different for each person depending on one's constitution. And the constitution of a person derives from factors like the parents and the time of conception. And someone's constitution is not just physical, it also includes the mind. A comparison between this 3 dosha theory and an European theory of the past called Humorism can be made. We will talk about Humorism extensively later. The 2 systems have different assumptions and a completely different history, but they have in common the conception that health, good or bad, results from the presence of different principles in the body, and that the cause of illness is an imbalance between these principles or between these elements. In that approach, the goal of medicine as prevention or as cure for an existing disorder is to preserve or restore the balance between doshas according to a particular person's needs. Modern medicine considers the basis of Ayurveda to be pseudoscientific because the doshas are not quantifiable. it is not possible to observe or measure them or explain a logical interaction between them and the health situation of a person. But despite this, it would be restrictive to limit Ayurveda or traditional Indian medicine to a set of unprovable hypotheses that were formulated more than 2000 years ago. Because the texts they are based on also defend a lot of principles and categories that are relevant to modern medicine. Ancient Ayurveda texts also taught surgical techniques based on a quite pertinent knowledge of anatomy, including, for example, how to extract kidney stones or foreign objects from someone's body. Ayurvedic therapies that typically include herbal medicines, diets, massages, or yoga also seem to emphasize the connection between body and mind. And this is not just magical thinking. It is a known fact that, at the very least, one can affect the other. These are not completely separate entities. The placebo effect, that is to say, the possibility that a substance or a treatment which has no measurable impact on people's body can help improve their health when they think it is an effective medicine, this is a strong clue that the state of mind and a kind of faith can have physical, biochemical consequences. This is why, in a clinical study, the efficiency of a treatment is always measured against a placebo. Because if it doesn't do better than the placebo, then the molecule or the treatment is probably not having any positive impact. Now, continuing with these ancient traditional medicines, another famous one is the Chinese tradition. But a bit like saying that Ayurveda is the one Indian traditional medicine, saying that there is one traditional Chinese medicine is a bit misleading. For a very long time, there were a variety of healing practices, herbal remedies, folk beliefs that sometimes competed against each other in China. In the early 20th century, there was a cultural war in Chinese medical circles. Cultural and political modernizers worked to eliminate traditional practices on the grounds that they were backward, unscientific. It didn't make them disappear, but it led to a reaction of traditional practitioners who selected elements of philosophy and practice and organized them into a system that they called Chinese medicine. And it is this system that is usually called traditional Chinese medicine. It is traditional in the sense that it is based on much more ancient practices and approaches, but it doesn't mean there was a unified system before. This being said, what these many regional or local healing practices had in common was a philosophy derived from empirical observation and principles of Taoist physicians, starting more than 2000 years ago. A fundamental belief in this system is that of causality. There would be a natural order of the universe, a balance, and everything that happens to man, including health problems, is the product of causes and effects that stem from a perturbation of this natural order. So in this system, a physical or mental disorder has causes that can be physical or spiritual, and what we call disease is a manifestation, not the problem itself. So treatments are attempts at restoring balance. In that sense, there is something in common with Indian traditions, even though the nature of this imbalance is looked at differently under a different angle. Chinese practitioners developed, like other traditions, a range of herbal and animal recipes for preparations, diet and exercise recommendations, but also types of therapies that are very particular, like Moxibustion and Acupuncture. Moxibustion is not as famous as acupuncture. It consists of burning dried mugwort on particular points of the body. Mugwort is a kind of flowering plant. The belief behind it, which is similar to the starting point of ancient acupuncture, is that every living person possesses vital force, or qi. This qi circulates through the body on invisible paths called meridians, and to ensure good health, this energy has to circulate freely. Moxibustion was believed to facilitate or unblock this circulation of vital force, of qi, the blockings being the cause of various conditions. It is on the same theoretical basis that acupuncture was invented, and it is a very old practice that we have traces of in the 2nd century BC. But here, instead of burning dried plants, needles were used to stimulate certain specific points of the body. Now, acupuncture is not an unified discipline. Like many Chinese concepts and practices of all sorts, it was exported to its Asian neighbors, so there is a variety of theoretical justifications to them at this point. The original concept of circulation of the vital force through meridians is no longer necessarily the basis of all these different practices of acupuncture. But after centuries and centuries, it is still widely used in China, with needles generally, more rarely through massages, pressures applied to certain points. And it has had some success in Western countries as well, where it is often used to attempt pain relief. There would be much to say about Chinese medicine, but to go on with our overview, let's return west to ancient Greece and Rome, where in the second half of the 1st millennium BC, important evolutions took place. The Greeks, from the classical period and before, practiced the same mix of magic or faith-based rituals and herbal or mineral or animal treatments. They had a healer god, Asclepius, the son of the god Apollo, but he was not the only health-related god in Greek mythology and religion. He had several daughters, including Hygeia, the goddess of cleanliness. Her name evolved into the word hygiene. Asiso, the goddess of the healing process, or Panacea, the goddess of a supposed universal remedy. There were more daughters and also several sons. Asclepius may not be the most famous of Greek gods. He doesn't really play a role in mythological stories, but you know at least his symbol, the rod of Asclepius, a snake-entwined staff, which has become a symbol of medicine today. Temples of Asclepius were the closest thing to a hospital or to the Egyptian houses of life that the Greeks had. People visited them for medical advice and healing. But as in other fields, the Greeks went a little bit further. More than other civilizations, they categorized, theorized, and searched for logical explanations with a freedom of thought and expression that other cultures did not necessarily have. And their culture produced a number of physicians that tried to not only practice but develop and better medicine. The most prominent is without a doubt Hippocrates. His name remains attached to the Hippocratic oath that physicians take in Western countries. The modern text of the Hippocratic oath are not exactly the Greek text. Modern physicians are not going to swear to ancient Greek healing gods. That would be absurd. But the spirit of respecting one's office, of respecting the patient, of not causing harm, are very close. They are basically principles that were put in writing many centuries ago. But apart from that, why is Hippocrates so important? Because with his followers, his students, they were the first to describe many diseases and medical conditions. They categorized illnesses in a way that is still relevant today: acute, chronic, endemic, epidemic. He introduced terms to describe the evolution of the stages of a pathology, like crisis, peak, and convalescence. Hippocrates also emphasized the need to ask as many information as possible to the patient, not just how the patient felt or where it hurt, but also where they had gone, the foods they had eaten, because all of this could be clues to a diagnosis or useful information to connect certain sets of conditions with pathologies. In his thought process, there was this sense of curiosity and questioning of past certainties or established theories that various Greek thinkers also had. A belief that betterment was a never-ending process and that things were not good just because they were ancient. And this type of mindset was much less present in ancient Egypt, for example. But Hippocrates, who lived between the 5th and 4th centuries BC, also had other important Greek successors. Two of them were Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios. They lived in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, that is to say in Greek-ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. And the two of them laid the foundations for the scientific study of anatomy and physiology in the 3rd century BC. And they did so by systematically performing dissections of bodies. In the Antiquity, be it for the Greeks or the Romans, dissection was a taboo, and it was socially unacceptable, including for medical reasons. But punctually, there was temporary lifting of the ban in Alexandria, and they took advantage of this to further their research. The inside of a human body was not that mysterious at the time. Thousands of years before them, the Egyptians were already masters at mummifying bodies, and this meant opening them and taking out the organs, so they knew how it was made inside. But the Egyptians never actually mapped the human body in its details, like the vascular system or the connections between organs, and they had little interest in discovering how it worked when people were alive. Their physicians had empirical knowledge of how it worked, but they never studied it like a kind of living machine, the way these Greek scholars did. And this opened an entire set of new questions. What is the difference between life and death? Are there parts of the body that control others? What is the nature of the connection between the material, the mind or the soul, and this flesh and bone organism? Yet another major Greek figure is Galen, who lived in the 2nd century AD under the Roman Empire. He researched more anatomy and practiced dissection on dead animals with the goal of later understanding the human body. He also traveled a lot around the Mediterranean Sea within the empire to be exposed to a wide variety of medical theories and discoveries, after which he settled in Rome. So his work provided like a synthesis of medical knowledge in the Roman and Greek world in the 2nd century AD. And it was very influential for more than 1,000 years in Western European, Islamic and Byzantine universities. He became the reference for medieval physicians. Like most Greek and Roman physicians since Hippocrates, he believed in the theory of humorism or humoralism. This theory was highly influential for a long time. It began to fall out of favor only in the 19th century, due to a number of new discoveries that we will talk about later. But before that, 2,000 years after Hippocrates, humorism was still the system that medical students learned in European universities. So what was humorism? It was the belief that human behavior and health was regulated by humors, chemical elements present in various proportions in their bodies. This intuition is probably more ancient than the Greek classical era. It could have roots in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Except initially these different humors were the fundamental elements: air, earth, fire and water, and sometimes others like metal. Hippocrates is credited with applying this concept, this idea, to medicine. We are not 100% sure it was him, but at least it emerged at the time of his life among Greek physicians. Except Hippocrates dropped the fundamental elements when it came to health and replaced them with bodily fluids. He distinguished 4 of them: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Together with other physicians, he posited that an excess or deficiency of any of these 4 humors could be the cause of illness. This theory spread to many scholars and was almost universally accepted in the Greek and then the Roman world. At the time of Galen, centuries after Hippocrates, it was considered solid, and Galen also believed in it, and he was very influential on medical teachings for centuries, as I said before. So this theory remained almost unquestioned until modern times. Humorism went even beyond illness. Some European scholars of the 17th and 18th centuries believed, for example, that humors determined the temperament, the personality of people, depending on the proportions of these humors in their system. There were different archetypal temperaments: phlegmatic, sanguine, choleric, melancholic, depending on the dominant humor in a person. And this could have even influenced the way they looked, with different body types and bone structure of the face. It could make us smile nowadays, but it was very serious back then, and some medical practices like bloodletting were based on humorism. There was the belief behind that reducing the quantity of blood in someone's system was a way of rebalancing humors. Some physicians had observed that bloodletting could make the temperature drop, and so fever could drop, for all the wrong reasons, because it weakens the body. But from that they concluded that bloodletting helped rebalance and improve the health of someone. Humorism was quickly abandoned in the 19th century when the germ theory and other medical discoveries made it unsustainable. But before that, for more than 2000 years, it remained the dominant medical theory in European medicine. Now, returning to the end of the Antiquity, the dislocation of the Western Roman Empire, and after that, the shrinking of the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, this led to a relative decline in the study and practice of medicine north of the Mediterranean Sea. It would be exaggerated to say that no progress was made at all, but the practice of research was almost abandoned for centuries. There were no centers of teaching until medieval universities appeared. So healing returned to being a very decentralized kind of practice, and a lot of antique theories of anatomical knowledge, the practice of complex surgery, it was almost entirely lost to medieval Europe, until the end of the Middle Ages, when research resumed in universities, especially in Italy at the start. As I said before, the Romans and the Greeks generally banned dissection of human bodies. It was taboo to them. And apart from a few exceptions, there was this temporary lifting of the ban in Alexandria, for example, and obviously there were people doing it discreetly and illegally. It made research in anatomy complicated. This ban went on during medieval times, but it was lifted in Italy during the late Middle Ages. On top of that, contacts with Byzantium intensified via Venice in particular, and slowly medicine got back the scholarly dimension it had lost. In medieval Europe, especially in villages and hamlets, where lived 90% of people, the central figures when it came to health were herborists and midwives, sometimes the same person. They had a knowledge of plant remedies transmitted orally and empirically, and they helped women give birth. In larger towns and cities, there were health institutions, most of the time paid for and run by the church. In the early Middle Ages, the one area where ancient medicine was preserved and perfected was the Islamic world. Islam had spread very fast from Arabia and came into contact with a lot of different cultures that all had long medical traditions: Greece, Rome, Persia, soon after the north of India. And so Muslim physicians adopted all these different legacies. The theory of humorism of Hippocrates and Galen was embraced, and in the relatively liberal atmosphere of the 8th to the 11th centuries in the Muslim world, they contributed to better this legacy, to complement it. Partly with research, for example in optics, the human eye was studied in detail, and for the first time the reactions of the eye to light were systematically studied. And at the time the most complicated types of surgeries took place in Muslim institutions. Another part was more empirical, and they made a huge contribution to the expansion of hospitals. They had observed, without knowing exactly why at the time, that cleanliness, hygiene, and the separation of patients, these strongly improved survival or recovery rates. And so this was applied to the most developed hospital system in the world. The hospital became a typical institution of Muslim cities. Like in Christendom, hospitals were generally attached to religious institutions, but there were many more of them, and in general they separated more the practice of religious activities from the practice of medicine. And so the physician became a known position in Muslim societies from Spain to India, at a time when trained physicians were quite rare in Europe. Both north and south of the Mediterranean, medical remedies used all kinds of herbs and minerals, but during the Middle Ages, the importance of exotic spices in these recipes rose quite a lot. This is one of the reasons why spices were so sought after and expensive. They were attributed all sorts of virtues that made people less sensitive to the prices. They kept buying whatever the cost. Now that we have made this quick overview of some ancient medical traditions, comes a question. Did they work or not? They certainly saved people by giving them a chance to be taken care of. They could alleviate pain, and there was always the placebo effect I mentioned earlier. So yes, they improved people's quality of life, at least. But looking at the world's life expectancy, it is hard to see much progress over time. Of course, we don't have precise statistics, but historians and demographs agree that life expectancy stayed relatively stable in every region of the world, from prehistory to the 18th century. Depending on the regions of the world, life expectancy at birth was between 26 and 35 years. That's not much. There was a lot of infant mortality, so for people who survived their first years, it was probably closer to 40-45 years. It could have been less without any medicine at all, so there's that. But it seems that the progress in knowledge, be it in anatomy, in remedies, in health policies, did not really lead to significant gains in life expectancy. The takeoff of life expectancy around the world really happened in the 19th century, and it was the product of different things: hygiene, better food, better material conditions in general, vaccines, surgery, antibiotics. Many of these aspects are medical or medical adjacent, and they can be credited to the introduction of modern science into the medical field. But before it bore tangible fruits, this revolution started earlier, in the 16th century, in the wake of the Renaissance. So let's take a look at this. As you know, the Renaissance brought an intense focus on scholarship to Europe. Scholarship rather than science in the modern sense. The initial appetite of Renaissance scholars was more to discover or rediscover ancient knowledge, texts and viewpoints. So there was a major effort to translate texts into Latin from Greek or Arabic, and this provided a base on which scholars could investigate systematically, on a scale that might never have existed before in human history. This questioning extended to distrusting or trying to validate traditional practices. And this was very important because some established medical practices were actually harmful. For example, there was a few effective drugs, but also a lot of folklore cures or metal-based compounds used as treatment that were actually poisonous. For several generations, this still did not provide much improvement in life expectancy, but several groundbreaking discoveries were made. They include the discovery of nerves and a new discipline, neurology, by Italian and French scholars of the 16th century. In England, in the 17th century, the correct circulation of blood was described for the first time. It was something that antique anatomy had not figured out. Also in the 17th century, the first microscopes permitted the discovery of bacteria. The first observation was made in the Netherlands, and it initiated the field of microbiology. Like in other fields of science, there was a growing separation between scientific research, scientific teaching, and religion. It didn't go without conflicts, but it was achieved, and from the 18th, even more in the 19th century, scientific research became fully autonomous, independent from churches and religious precepts. Things were also changing in societies. Science became held in high esteem socially, especially from the 18th century, at the time of Enlightenment. For physicians, becoming more scientific was a way of upgrading their social status, because at the time, discoveries did not necessarily spread instantly. They did between elite circles in each country, but there were barely any public health policies, and the health field was also very crowded with all sorts of practitioners. There were self-trained barbers practicing surgery. The two professions often came together. There were many apothecaries, some of them being just charlatans selling miracle drugs. Still plenty of midwives who were the only health workers in villages and had no training. They learned from their mothers and from experience. A long process of professionalization began. In cities of Italy, Germany, France, England, all over Europe basically, the oldest functioning hospitals often date back from the 16th to the 18th centuries, when this process began. And the first modern hospitals were generally also centers of research and education for health workers, from physicians to nurses. The main discovery that emerged from the 18th century is probably the realization that hygiene was crucial. This is something that had intuitively been guessed in various parts of the world, dating back from the Antiquity. I told you earlier about the Greek goddess of hygiene, who was identified with good health, or Islamic hospitals of the Middle Ages. But it was discovered that it could extend to food preparation and conservation, to surgery. Some of the most powerful and effective new techniques of the 19th century were actually the development of aseptic operating theaters, of antiseptics, and bacteriology and the germ theory. Anesthesia was also developed in the 19th century. But let's take things in order, beginning with maybe the most life-changing discovery, bacteriology and germ theory. I told you that the discovery of the existence of living microorganisms dated from the 17th century, with the first microscopes. 19th century scientists pushed this much further, with a series of discoveries. First, in the 1830s, that microorganisms were responsible for alcoholic fermentation, which had been known and used for millennia, but never explained before. Around 1850, the humorist theory began to lose ground, because it had been observed that basic hygiene measures could dramatically improve death rates. For example, physicians or midwives that attended childbirth never washed their hands with soap until then. It sounds dreadful, but nobody even thought about it. A major factor of mortality for mothers back then was infections caught giving birth. This is called childbed fever. But it was believed that infections were caused by so-called miasmas, like foul odors that traveled in the air. No one believed that infections could be transmitted by the dirty hands of the health professionals. In 1847, an Austrian physician realized that the death rate of mothers could be dramatically reduced just by this simple measure, cleaning one's hands. But it took several years before the measure spread, because people would just not believe this. But the germ theory was about to revolutionize medicine, and it started with a French scientist, Louis Pasteur. He made the hypothesis that these microorganisms responsible for alcoholic fermentation, that were now well known, may also be the cause of contagious diseases. A few years later, a British surgeon, Joseph Lister, took this hypothesis seriously and introduced antisepsis, that is to say the elimination of microorganisms. Alcohol was an effective antiseptic in wound treatment, and he realized that this dramatically reduced the occurrence and intensity of infections. Also elaborating on Pasteur's discoveries, a German physician, Robert Koch, laid the foundations of the germ theory of disease by cultivating bacteria and inoculating them to test animals, proving that a living organism could be contaminated by bacteria and develop a disease. This launched a race to isolate and discover the bacteria, the germs, responsible for different diseases. In 1881, Koch discovered the one responsible for tuberculosis, which cemented the germ theory. Another innovation derived from bacteriology and the discovery of the role of microorganisms was vaccination, another effort led by Pasteur, who introduced a rabies vaccine. Now vaccination had an ancestor, inoculation. It was not known why, but it had been observed generations earlier that people could be voluntarily infected with a small quantity of germs from a sick person. They would develop a mild version of the disease, recover, and no longer be at risk of developing it again. They had gained immunity. This was a risky operation. Sometimes people did not recover, but overall it improved their life expectancy. And in some royal families of the 18th century, inoculation of smallpox was made. Nobody knew why it worked, since this kind of contagious diseases were attributed to miasmas, but what vaccination did was to make this process of gaining immunity much more systematic and less risky, because a weakened pathogen was injected, reducing dramatically the risk of contracting a serious form of the disease. These examples of Koch and Pasteur reflect the increasing role of science in medicine and the huge benefits of finding applications to fundamental research. It went on in the 20th century with many more groundbreaking innovations that we don't have time to all detail tonight. But they include antibiotics, antivirals, blood transfusions, medical imaging, thanks to research in physics on X-rays and waves, the discovery of active molecules from chemical research that gave birth to new families of drugs. But the evolution of medicine is not just discoveries. It comes with infrastructure and social change, especially professionalization, not only of physicians, but all medical personnel. And here another important figure of the 19th century is Florence Nightingale. she can be considered the founder of modern nursing. Until the 19th century, the personnel in European hospitals was mostly nuns and helpers, a majority of them women, but without any professional training. They just learned as they went, taught by their colleagues, and from their own experience. Their only training was more in methods of physical care, but they were told nothing about actual medicine. It was very difficult for women to become physicians until relatively recently, until the 20th century. They could not study medicine, it was socially unacceptable, and paradoxically, women had provided probably the majority of health workers since ancient times, as midwives and healers. But the beginning of professionalization of health professions in the 19th century sidelined them. They could not learn medicine, so they were turned into medical housekeepers with no formation and no legitimacy to take decisions. Florence Nightingale was born in a wealthy and well-connected British family, meaning she received a good education, and actually she also became a statistician. But she came to prominence while serving as a manager and trainer of nurses during the Crimean War. This war opposed Russia to a coalition led by Great Britain and France to block Russian expansionist views against the Ottoman Empire. Most of the fighting took place between an Anglo-French expedition and the Russian army in Crimea, and that's how a British nurse participated in this war. Casualties in this war were horrendous. This was one of the first industrial wars, a few years before the American Civil War. But apart from the fighting, another cause of mortality was disease, due to a high concentration of men in bad hygiene conditions. During this conflict, Florence Nightingale organized care for soldiers, and her image of dedication gave nursing a favorable reputation. So she became very popular in Victorian society, a consensual and positive figure. But she went much further and used this image and her connections to professionalize nursing. In 1860, she established a nursing school, which was the first secular institution of that kind in the world. This did not only emulate many more nursing schools around the world, it gave nurses a status as medical professionals, able to actively contribute to the patient's treatment, take initiatives, and it expanded the acceptable form of female participation in the workforce. Still, there were barriers in the medical world. It is now commonplace to find women among physicians. No one is surprised by that. But until the 1970s, in Europe and North America, that was very rare. Women have been able to reinvest all professions of the medical world only in the past few decades. Apart from her role in the professionalization of nurses, Florence Nightingale is also a multifaceted character. She was an activist who worked for hunger relief in India. She advocated social reforms to improve healthcare for all sections of British society. And she was a gifted mathematician. She developed the use of pie charts to present statistics, for example, something that was not done before. The first pie charts appeared at the beginning of the 19th century, but she adapted them to make them easily readable. The spectacular development of modern medicine was just beginning at the dawn of the 20th century, and there would be much more to say about this, from surgery to drugs to transplants to new forms of therapies or vaccines. but I leave these topics for science stories in the future. For tonight, we have reached the end of this overview, and you can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story if you wish to. I'll be back soon with another story, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.